I'd like to try and tidy up this corner of the workshop. Free up a bit of bench space, you know? It's getting a little bit cramped in here. So the first job is to deal with that little pile of lathe tools behind the bench grinder. All the tools are mounted in quick change tool post holders, and I'd like to make a little rack for them to keep them all nice and organised. My original thought was to make something to go on the wall just here, but with a little bit more thought, I think it's probably better to have a little rail that goes across the back of the lathe like this. This should save a little bit of time each time I need to change tool. It also means if I'm using coolant, when I take the tool out of the tool post and put it back on the rack, all of the coolant just drips back down into the lathe. The first job was to get the backsplash out and onto the bench. It's looking pretty tatty, but it did spend quite a bit of its life outside, so that's no surprise. I think we'll probably have to do something about all this rust while we're doing this job as well. After a quick measure up and digging out some steel angle from the parts bin, it's time to get on with this job. I started by marking out and just cutting a couple of pieces of angle to length to make a basic frame. The angle grinder with a little thin slitting disc made light work of that job. The idea is that this piece will go on here, and there'll be a vertical going down to this diagonal brace, and then the tool rail itself will go from here over to the other side. I gave all the areas that are going to be welded a good clean up with the angle grinder. Since I'm using a TIG welder, it's particularly important that everything's nice and clean before you start. Just check that everything's nice and square. While it's just tacked together, it's quite easy to adjust. There we go, perfect. Just a tack in each corner is sufficient to stop the piece from moving at this stage. For the vertical piece, I decided to do a mitered corner. Now this isn't really necessary, but it's nice to practice on something that, at the end of the day, doesn't really matter that much. The two pieces just fit together like this, with a 45-degree angle on each one. I used a little angle plate and a couple of C-clamps to just hold the corner together while I put some tacks on. Again, just tacks at this stage. I like to get everything in place before I fully weld anything. Since the new frame sits on top of the back of the splashback, at the opposite end I needed a little doubler plate to bring it up to the correct height. This is the outside edge of the splashback being welded to the doubler. I'm not sure what it is about edge welds, but I've always struggled with them. I'm quite happy with how this one's turned out. The tool rail will span the gap between the doubler plate and the new frame. It should sit something like this. Then it was a case of just welding all the bits together. Here's what the frame looks like. It's turned out quite nicely. Everything's nice and square. At the headstock end of the tool rail, I'd like to have a little feature that holds the chuck keys for the various chucks for the lathe. For this, I cut down some 1 3/4 inch tube. I used the old masking tape around the tube trick to make sure the cut was square. I welded the little bits of tube on with a couple of short stitch welds. I'm just using a bit of mild steel filler even though it's stainless to steel, as it's all going to get painted and it's never going to see any real load. I did 3 large tubes for chuck keys, 2 for the ones I already have and 1 as a spare. I also put on a tall thin tube for the wrench that does the quick change tool post. This next section along is where I'd like to mount all of the tool holders. I'd like to have a little upstand feature that fits into this slot so the tool holder can just slot onto it, kind of like it does onto the tool post. I had some more steel angle left over from another project, so I marked out and just cut some simple L brackets. I think I made 15 in total, so I've got a little bit of growing room if I get some more tools for the lathe in future. I just roughly positioned the first bracket where I wanted it and clamped it in place with a C-clamp. A tack on all 4 corners will be more than strong enough to hold these in place. They don't need fully welding. The next bracket just butts up against the previous one, and then it's just rinse and repeat until all the brackets are on. Here's the last one going on. This would have been much faster with a MIG welder, but I've only got a TIG at the moment. At the tailstock end of the tool rail, I wanted some holders for the tailstock tools. So I marked out, centre punched and pilot drilled 3 holes. One for the revolving centre, one for the drill chuck and one as a spare. I then opened the holes out using a fine-tooth hole saw. These are absolutely fantastic on thin material, where a normal hole saw is a lot more grabby and snatchy. I'll drop a link in the description. Here's another opportunity for the little Noga deburring tool to shine. Okay, they fit quite nicely, but I'm not a fan of how this is able to wobble around in here. To fix this problem, I've cut some little steel tubes, and I've got this little offcut here to just go down inside to keep everything aligned while I weld them in position. Just like at the other end, a couple of little stitch welds are all that's required. Oops, I've put a little bit too much heat into that. There we go. That's better, and one for spare. On the subject of spares, I've left this little space here just in case I want to add something in future. With all the fabricating done, it's time to give the thing a darn good clean. This thing is rusty, dirty, oily, it's just generally filthy, and before any paint goes on it, it needs a really good clean. After a good going over with the wire wheel, I gave it a clean with some white spirit to get rid of all the oil and grease. Paint-wise, I had a little look round in the cupboard and found a tin of heavy-duty floor paint. Now this stuff's really hard wearing, which means it should be quite good for a machine, but there is the question of whether it will stick or not. It seemed to go on really well, but I guess only time will tell on that one. And here it is, the finished tool rack. Thankfully the paint did stick. Just based on first impressions, I think it's going to work really well. I've got a dedicated space for all of the most commonly used tools, and a few slots left over for if I get some extras in future. I've also gained a little bit of workbench back, and the workshop looks a little bit less cluttered. Now, unfortunately, there isn't going to be a video next week, but hopefully we should be back in the workshop the week after. I've got a couple more workshop infrastructure projects planned, so hopefully I'll see you then. Until then, thanks for watching.